Hello and welcome to another episode of Earth911's Sustainability in Your Ear. I'm Mitch Ratcliffe, your host, and we're back with another innovator interview. Today, we're going to talk about your influence as a consumer on the direction of the economy. You know, we all have influence in large and small ways. People acting together amplify that power and can lead to social and economic change. We're joined today by Dan-Smythe. He's the Vice President of Retail and Hospitality at EPAM, a technology and business strategy consultancy. EPAM recently released the second in a series of consumer surveys, Consumers Unmasked, which examined changing spending habits and behaviors during the pandemic. They found that people are actively considering companies' environmental and social impacts when making purchasing decisions. For example, 46% of survey respondents said they will buy sustainable products when the choice is available. Respondents also showed growing sophistication about corporate sustainability and social performance. 14% factor social responsibility performance into buying decisions, and 13% consider whether products and raw materials are sourced sustainably. Now, those are low levels, yes, but the figures increased by almost 90% in just 1 year. So people are paying more attention to these issues all the time. The honesty and transparency of companies is now one of the most important features for shoppers. All of this points to a sea change in the priorities of companies that want to keep their customers in the climate crisis era. After reading the report, we wanted to discuss how consumers can exercise their influence and learn more about what people care about 2 years into the pandemic. You can learn more about EPAM at www.epam.com. That's EPAM. Welcome to the show, Dan. How are you today?
I'm good. Thanks very much for having me, Mitch.
Well, thanks for joining us. And I wanted to start off what I thought was a surprising and pretty encouraging finding in the research, and that is that people are optimistic. Despite all the disruption of the past 2 years, they express hope. What does that suggest about our ability to make further changes for the better?
Well, you know, it's funny. Before I get into that, I want to share a little bit about how we determined that people were feeling hopeful and optimistic. We used a tool called Blob Tree that asked consumers to look at a bunch of figures on a tree and pick the one that most reflected how they feel. And from those responses, we were able to infer their sentiment, right?
Right.
So that's how we learned that there's this optimism and hope. But I want to point out it wasn't just that. It was mixed with a certain amount of apprehension. And so to answer your question, I think what it means for retailers and brands is it's really important to provide assurances, right? When consumers are apprehensive, they're hopeful but apprehensive, right? So 79% of consumers said they felt comfortable shopping in a mall. 78% felt comfortable eating in a restaurant. 76% felt comfortable returning to the workplace. That's still, 20 to 25% of people who are uncomfortable, right? And that could change if there's another new variant of COVID, for example, right? So if we think about the kind of roller coaster we've been on between, everybody getting vaccinated and we started getting unmasked, and then Delta came along and the masks came back on, at least in the United States, and then everybody started getting back to normal, and then Omicron came on. So there's still this apprehension. I think what we need to do is we can't control whether there's another variant, but what we can control are things like hygiene practices, like in restaurants, making sure servers are wearing masks, right? Doing things that make people feel comfortable doing those things they may be apprehensive about, right? Making sure that the number of people inside a restaurant doesn't exceed a certain amount so you don't feel too crowded, right? Keeping good ventilation. So all those things that make people feel apprehensive that are within our control, we should control. And that's really, what I think is important. And we've seen that in the travel industry with airlines and hotels, changing their sanitation practices and that sort of thing. We saw it with grocery stores often offering curbside pickup, drive up and go type services. So I think we'll continue to see that. And I think that's important as people sort of get out of this apprehensiveness and,
let's hope we have a chance to before something else comes along.
Exactly. Couldn't agree more.
But assurances is an important word here to understand, and that means sharing information and changing behaviors. For instance, putting masks on the servers in a restaurant. But for instance, if I'm shopping and thinking about buying something and its impact on the planet, I need more information today. It's clear from your findings.
Absolutely.
Where does sustainability rank in the consideration hierarchy amongst consumers? And does it differ in the EU and the US? Because you've surveyed both regions.
That's right. It does. So sustainability was one of 8 themes that emerged from the study. So it's definitely one of the top 8 criteria, right? It does vary by category. So food, for example, we asked about 10 different factors that consumers value when buying food. And across the board, sustainable sources rank number 7 out of 10 across geographies, right? So it's not in the top 5, but it is in the top 10. However, if we look at respondents in Europe, it was in the top 5, ranked number 5, whereas in the US it ranked number 8. So we do see a little higher emphasis in Europe. And we've seen, that didn't surprise me. I think Europe is a little bit ahead of the curve on sustainability in general. With fashion, another category, we asked about sustainable supply chains, right? And that ranked 4 out of 5 attributes that we asked about. And that was fairly consistent across geographies, though a bit higher in the UK, where it was about 24% in the UK, closer to 21% in the US and other parts of Europe. So that was interesting to see those differences across categories.
Well, and the report says explicitly the direction of consumer sentiment is unmistakable. That's a quote. With regard to environmental and social responsibility, I was intrigued by the fact that you found that 39% of respondents are considering buying used items in the next year in order specifically to reduce their impact. Does that reflect a changing set of values in the consumer's desire for stuff in the broadest sense? Are they now really considering seriously buying more used items rather than buying new, which comes with a heavier carbon footprint?
Yeah, I do think consumer sentiment is starting to change. And that's why we're seeing more retailers and brands offering these types of sustainable options. Mm-hmm. I do think that it's not one size fits all, though. I think that some consumers are a lot more concerned, whereas others are less so. And you see that with different brands adjusting their strategies according to what their target consumer really cares about. I don't think it's going to be a dramatic, radical realignment. I think it's gonna be a little bit more gradual. But like you said in the beginning, we saw over almost 90% increase in the number of people who really care about this and the importance of it. And so I think if that trend continues, we'll see some gradual but meaningful changes over the next few years.
Well, and let's talk about assurances and that transparency that we were discussing earlier, which your advice to retailers is, and again, a quote, ensure that company policies, safety measures, and communications align and deliver the honesty and transparency that consumers seek. What does that transparency need to look like? And let's take just one sector, and that is in e-commerce and shopping for items. How should a retailer start to address that sustainability-minded consumer with information to make them feel comfortable with make a purchase decision?
Well, I think it's really I think it needs to be akin to if you think about restaurants. In some states, restaurants are required to disclose the calorie count on the menu. Right. So there's that transparency. I think we need to see something like that for things like carbon emissions, right? So that there's a very easy to read and interpret piece of information so consumers can make informed choices between products or between providers, right? I think that an example of this would be that wasn't required by law would be Whole Foods Market, where you have the animal welfare rating at the meat counter. So you can choose whether you want to buy the beef from this provider or that provider based on their animal welfare. And it's very easy to read. It's a numerical system, right? It's like reading the calorie counter, comparing price on an e-commerce site, the example you gave. I think that's probably the most valuable method of transparency that retailers can offer. It's something that makes it more comparable.
So thinking about this from the EPAM technology and business consulting perspective, rather than the survey, what recommendations would you make to help retailers show so much more information? That's one of the most challenging issues here is that, at the meat counter, you're thinking about animal welfare, and you should be thinking about carbon footprint too. But as you move through the store, there's such a range of different factors to consider, all of which are relevant. What do we do about communicating this information in a meaningful and useful way? Have you guys begun to address that in some of your work with clients?
Yeah, I can't point to specific examples, but one of the things that I'd like to see more of is that kind of transparency on, for example, e-commerce sites where you can compare pricing, you can compare other attributes like on a menu where you can compare calorie counts, or at the meat counter where you can compare the animal welfare rating. I think that we should see more e-commerce sites showing within the product information things like the carbon footprint measured in some apples to apples way, like greenhouse gas emissions, some comparable unit of measure. Right. I think that, or the way nutritional labels appear on consumer packaged food. Right. You can compare the calorie counts as well as the protein, the fat, the carbohydrates, et cetera. Right. Sodium content. Right. I think we should have, a little chart. I don't think it needs to be complicated, but I think that there should be easy to read and easy to compare information. Not only on product packaging, but also on e-commerce sites so that consumers have that information. I think having the apples to apples sort of standard, if we get to a standard that everyone uses.
That's the key.
Yeah. I think
and right now, because we live in an environment where different consultants have different methodologies, and so therefore your footprint doesn't read the same as somebody else's, so they're not directly comparable. It is confusing, and simplifying this is clearly one of the things that will galvanize the sustainability oriented shopper.
Absolutely. And I think it would cut through the greenwashing, right? You have companies touting, we do this and that. Well, it sounds great, but is that on all your product, or is it on 3% of your product and you're just doing it to get good PR, right? So by having that standard, I think it really cuts through a lot of the, the what's the hype versus reality.
Do you see any evidence of that standard emerging, or do you see at this point simply a lot of people rushing in that general direction with all the variability in how they measure or express that information?
I think it's very slow, right? I've seen it in travel, where on certain travel portals, you can choose, when you're choosing different flights, you can see the estimated carbon emissions of the different itineraries, right? So I could see something like that emerging in other areas, but I have yet to see one single standard for, apparel, for example.
Well, and I think that's the key to us moving from, it's like the adoption of digital technology. We talk about younger people as digital natives, but that's because they grew up in an environment where all that information was available, and we knew what a bit and a byte and what a CPU were, right? And now that we've become digitally native, we're about to become sustainably native over another generation as we explain the same information again, or similar information again. So let's move to another area that you talked about, which is this huge uptick in food delivery and e-commerce. Everybody is focused on getting immediate gratification. Are consumers aware of the link between that immediate gratification and the rising environmental impacts of delivery services? Do you think they're thinking critically about those, or are they rushing to the most convenient option?
So while we didn't ask about this explicitly in our study, my intuition and based on my own anecdotal observations, I think most consumers are not aware of it, right? Because I personally live in a household where we're very anti-home delivery, and yet sometimes when people hear that, they're like, "Why?" They're surprised, right? It's not immediately obvious to them, right? And I have to explain, well, actually it's better, it's more efficient for the plant from an emission standpoint to send a full truckload of pallets of cases to a store and have you stop at the store and buy that stuff on your way home from work, which you're driving to anyway, than it is for a small truck full of little packages coming to your house every day and going to all these, I had to explain it. And I think that those who are aware, because many are aware, even though I think most aren't, are either kind of in denial, or they'll justify it through other things like, well, but I recycle, so I don't have to worry about all these boxes because I'm recycling them, so it's okay. Or I drive an electric vehicle, so I'm offsetting it through that. So it's okay because I really need my convenience. And so I think, it's okay. That's the impression I have. Anecdotally, I'd like to see more data on that. And I personally am an evangelist for the efficiency. In fact, one exception to my household is one of my daughters who loves DoorDash, and I have to keep reminding her that
I have a daughter like that too.
Yeah, there's plenty of food in the house. We don't need to be adding to the carbon emissions by having someone drive to a restaurant and then drive to our house with food that you don't really need.
Food that you don't really need. That it really is the key here. And you mentioned this earlier, but this offset thinking. Okay, well, I'm doing that good thing. It is. I don't think people currently understand that you are then over impacting in other ways rather than simply offsetting. And so that's a form of internal greenwashing I think a lot of us are doing. And it's going to be interesting to see how consumers think about that. And a good example of that is what you found in fashion. Only 22% of respondents said they would switch brands if they found out the fashion they were buying is not sustainably sourced. So that makes sustainability a second-tier issue after price, quality, and convenience. Do fashion brands that fail to start to express their environmental progress risk losing customers? Do you think we've gotten to that point?
On the margin, yes, but I don't think it's significant, right? I think on the topic, just backing up a step to the topic of delivery, right? And one of the things I was thinking about is whether or not people would actually pay more, right? If they had the option to have a more efficient, home delivery, like an EV delivery, right? And I thought about that and looking at, I think it's analogous to would people pay more for renewable electricity, right? Sure. And so I found a study from Yale University a few years ago that surveyed that, and it was less than 50% would be willing to pay more, and that's when asked.
It's changed though. I've seen very recent data, 2020 and 2021, that show particularly generationally, it declines as you get older. People are very likely as millennials or Gen Z to spend more to get something like an EV delivery, although there's all sorts of implications of that, right? Because if I charge my EV with fossil fuels, it doesn't help. But that kind of transparency needs to be, again, propagated so that everybody can make those informed decisions. Going back to this kind of idea of a tipping point where consumers, 39% say they want to buy used stuff instead of new stuff to reduce their impact. 22% of fashion shoppers will switch if they don't get a sustainable brand. Is it 50% where you just have reached the point where more people rather than fewer are interested in sustainability, that things change?
I think right now it's again, not one size fits all, right? You have different customer segments, right? And different brands target different customers and different segments. And if I take an example from, I used to work quite a bit with mass retailers and like Target and Walmart, right? And they would survey customers on a regular basis, and they'd look at differences in responses between their customers, so a Target customer versus a Walmart customer versus other, customers. And what's interesting is one of the questions that's commonly asked is, I prefer to shop or do business with companies that share my values. Right. And a Target shopper, that response was very high. And a Walmart shoppers, that response was very low. So you get different customer segments. And so I think with some brands, you're going to see a bigger impact than others, and you're going to see some stratification of brands that are highly, focused on this, and some that aren't because their customers simply don't care. The tipping point, in my opinion, I'm just guesstimating based on looking at other factors that people care about. It's probably in the 30s. I think actually, so I'm maybe more optimistic than you that it's, below the 50%. I think if you compare it to something, some of the other things we asked about in our survey, we looked at, well, one thing we found is that 35% of consumers in the US will stop buying from a brand that treats staff badly. And now we're seeing brands actually making changes to improve how they treat staff. For example, Walmart paying their store employees more, giving them more education benefits. And,
right.
And you're seeing even Amazon, giving bonuses to their warehouse workers and promoting what a great job that is, right? And now part of it is because, they're having trouble with retention, but there's also part of it is public image, and they want to make sure that they're perceived as treating their employees well. I think that again, that's 35%. I think once we see 30+% of consumers saying they'll switch brands if a company doesn't have sustainable supply chain, then I think we'll start to see more companies investing in their sustainability of the supply chain.
So one of the other issues that I wanted to ask you about is you covered this rising tide of subscription-based services, including the idea of products as a service, which means that you would essentially lease your phone or your TV or your computer. And there's actually news this week about Apple considering this. That would allow the company to take responsibility for the products, recycle them at the end of life, and really tell the consumer from beginning to end, we're stewarding these materials and you can count on it. Do you think that's a smart strategy to engage sustainability-minded shoppers, or are they going to say, I'd rather buy and own something?
I think it's a smart strategy. Again, we didn't ask specifically about this in our study, but intuition tells me, in my experience working with retailers, it tells me that that companies will probably, they certainly can do this, and I think it's a great strategy. Will they is up in the air. I think that
execution versus intent is the important distinction.
Yeah, I think from a company standpoint, when there's obvious value to the product, the end of life product, the spent product, then it's a no-brainer. So take ink cartridges, for example, right? Yeah. It's much cheaper to refill an old ink cartridge than it is to manufacture a new ink cartridge. And so you see Staples giving you, a rebate for returning your spent cartridges. You're seeing the Endless Ink subscription service from HP, things like that, right? Those, I think, are no-brainers, and we're going to continue to see that. When there's not obvious value in the spent product, it becomes a lot harder because companies ultimately, they're going to focus on the bottom line, right? So we are seeing more in apparel, companies offering their own resale. For example, you can buy a Patagonia,
forms of recycling. I mean, literally, they're retailified forms of recycling. So should companies, and you're right, higher value materials certainly have perceived importance to get back and to reuse, but so much of what we buy could be returned in some way, particularly the packaging, for reuse.
Yeah.
Can we rethink even the retail industry as a bidirectional logistics system rather than a unidirectional, just we're sending stuff to you and it's your problem? Should maybe companies be thinking about embracing a partnership with consumers to recycle more?
I think so. I mean, you're already seeing it with Apple phones, right? You get value for your phone if you trade it in. I think that unfortunately the infrastructure isn't set up for that two-way. Most retailers struggle with what we call reverse logistics. It's basically sending product back up the supply chain, and a lot of them have to outsource it to a third-party logistics provider. And so it incurs quite a bit of extra cost the way companies are built today, because their logistics systems they're built for one-way travel, right? They're not built for that circular supply chain that you're talking about. But I think there is an opportunity there, and we're seeing more subscription-based services, especially with durable goods like automotive, where instead of buying a car, you actually have a subscription where you just get a car and for a certain period of time, and then maybe you get a different car. And so I think we'll see more companies experimenting with that. Yeah. It'll be, I think, interesting to see, whether it actually takes off and becomes mainstream.
So the last thing I wanted to ask about is, our listeners want to know how to increase their influence with all these brands. And of course, they can't wait to be surveyed randomly to have an impact. What do you suggest? Because you're listening to your clients all the time. How can consumers exercise their influence effectively with the brands that you're familiar with?
I'd say vote with your wallet and
Okay.
encourage your friends and everyone else to do the same. I think that, companies make decisions most of them based on shareholder value. So anything that is going to affect their business is going to drive their decisions.
Does that mean that you should just simply not buy something that's not sustainable, or should you communicate it as well? Is there a way to amplify the fact that you didn't use your money?
Absolutely. I think that, with social media now, I think there's a lot of ways to communicate and kind of spread the word in a grassroots kind of way. And companies do monitor social media sentiment. So you don't necessarily need to wait to be surveyed to have get their attention. I think that, I think seeking out opportunities that may be less obvious to switch to more sustainable solutions. Like you mentioned, the subscription model. Well, that already exists in some areas. People just don't use it. For example, milk. Remember the milkman?
Yep. I'm old enough to remember that too.
So that was a subscription service, and that your milk bottles got washed and refilled, right? You just leave it, and that still exists today, believe it or not. There are local dairies that will deliver your milk in glass bottles. You leave your old bottles, they take them and they leave you. I mean,
it sounds crazily modern, doesn't it?
Yeah,
and yet it's a 150-year-old idea.
Exactly. So not only are you supporting a local dairy, but you're also helping the planet by not buying your milk in plastic jugs or wax cartons that are going to be, on the planet forever. And so single use, right? Single use, and yet you may recycle it, but that's not nearly as good as refilling a glass bottle. So you vote with your wallet and be creative and don't support businesses that you don't believe in, whose practices you don't believe in. Find alternatives, even if it means spending a little bit more. I mean, I couldn't say it, vote with your wallet and communicate it. And I think you'll see change happen.
Well, Dan, I think that's a great bit of advice, and we'll finish on that. I look forward to talking about the next version of the consumer survey.
Thank you very much, Mitch. Appreciate you having me on.
Thank you. We've been talking with Dan-Smythe. He's the Vice President of Retail and Hospitality at EPAM, which is a technology and business strategy consultancy. You can check out EPAM at www.epam.com and take some time to check out the Consumers Unmasked report. We'll include a link, but you can find it at the EPAM site. Once again, we've heard that sustainability is becoming not a tidal wave, but it is definitely a wave that is passing through the economy and hopefully will change it permanently. And, it's up to each of us to communicate, not just by not spending money on unsustainable products and services, but to spend money on sustainable products and services while telling the companies that are not keeping up with our expectations that they need to do better. We can drive things in the right direction, but it takes time and effort and maybe sometimes some uncomfortable conversations with managers at stores when you say, look, I'd love to shop here, but you don't do a good job. This is Earth911, Sustainability in Your Ear. We're, of course, going to be back with another innovator interview soon. In the meantime, I hope you'll take a few minutes and share this podcast, along with all the others that we have done, with your friends and family so that they can start thinking about more ideas to create less waste. We can make this happen. Folks, take care of yourself, take care of one another, and let's all take care of this beautiful planet of ours. We'll be back soon. Have a green day.